Well, hi, everybody. I'm Ron Amundsen. I'm Chair of Environmental Science Policy and Management, and welcome to the 2013 Hans Jenny Memorial Lecture. This past week, I've been attending a couple meetings here on campus, and one of the things that struck me is that there were luminaries in attendance that were described as rock stars of various arenas. There was the rock star of food at one meeting, the rock star of sustainable development at another. You can probably put a face to these names if you think about it. And I was thinking, while it's cool to be in the presence of a rock star of sustainable food, for example, it's kind of a diminished sort of rock stardom when it's only metaphorical rather than actual or real, unqualified. Well, today I can say, I'm pleased to say and introduce to you a rock star, period. Professor David Montgomery. David's a geologist and professor of geomorphology in the Department of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington. In the earth and soil sciences, David's well known for his rigorous and innovative research on landscape evolution. In 2008, he received a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, and I want to read a little bit from their excellent summary of his work. David Montgomery is a geomorphologist making fundamental contributions to our understanding of the geophysical forces that determine landscape evolution and how we use soils and how our use of soils and rivers has shaped civilizations past and present. A prolific and versatile scientist, Montgomery's numerous publications have explored how landslides and glacial erosion influence the height of mountains, how rivers originate and shape the landscape, and how human modification of river channels affects aquatic ecosystems, along with other probing questions about the Earth's surface. Unsettling conceived wisdom about environmental change at both the local and global levels, Montgomery's field studies have taken him throughout the Pacific Northwest, his home and research base, to the Himalayas, the Andes, and the canyons of Mars, of course via NASA's Mars Orbital Laser Altimeter. For one major research program, he investigated the role of sediment and wood debris in altering stream and river channels and developed novel methods for measuring channel stability, anthropogenic disturbances, and conditions conducive to salmon spawning. This led to his book, King of Fish, The 1,000-Year Run of Salmon, a well-received book on the history of humans' impacts on salmon populations. Montgomery broadens the research of his field studies beyond the scientific community by distilling his findings to support applied research on the ecological management of mountain rivers. His second book, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, chronicles the role of soil in the evolution of ancient and modern societies and offers a number of solutions to contemporary soil degradation worldwide. With a scientist's rigor, a historian's curiosity, and an environmentalist's passion, David is leading investigations into the ecological consequences of a wide range of Earth's surface processes. Well, I think probably some of you are saying to yourself, well, this is all quite interesting, but it isn't the kind of rock star you were thinking of. But I want to point out David's the other kind of rock star, too. He serves as a lead guitarist or a vocalist in bands such as Flat Earth, The Reckless Pedestrians, and most recently, Big Dirt, right? He's more than a rock star, he's a rock star squared. So I want to conclude by saying that David is a wonderful choice for today's Jenny Lecture. David passed through the Berkeley campus as a graduate student of Bill Dietrich's during the last few years of Hans Jenny's life. David's research on biotic mechanisms of soil movement, including the globally disruptive human biota, carries on a strong tradition of soils research affiliated with the Berkeley campus. Today's lecture springs from his most recent book, The Rocks Don't Lie, A Geologist Investigates Noah's Flood. I would just want to say it's a wonderful book, one that provides new and provocative views of the long and sometimes conflicting misunderstanding or intersection between science and faith. And I want to conclude my introduction by sharing with you just a little bit of David's wonderful prose. He writes, I find that the wonder in reading rocks and topography and in understanding the vast scope of geologic time rivals that of religious belief. In either one can find a taste of the infinite and of things far grander than ourselves. Yet no honest search for truth can deny geological discoveries, not when Earth's marvelous story is laid out for all those to see in the very fabric of our world. We may argue endlessly about how to interpret the Bible, but the rocks don't lie. They tell it like it was. So with that, please join me in welcoming David Montgomery.
Ron, thank you very much for that invitation, and also for the invitation to come and talk today. Thanks to all of you for coming today. It's a real personal honor for me to be invited to give the Hansiani Memorial Lecture, in part because one of the, I saw a lecture by Hans when I took Ron's class some 20 odd years ago. And he came in and just gave this amazing lecture about how you could read the history of European thought about soils from landscape painting. And that intersection between the humanities and science apparently stuck with me a little bit more than he might have imagined. As I'll go through, led in a roundabout way, some what I'll talk today. So thank you for the invitation. It's an honor for me to be back on campus. I doubt that Bill imagined that when he signed my thesis that some 20 years later I'd be back talking about my work on Noah's flood. So surprises are the currency of life. Well, so why would a geologist like myself write a book about the world's flood stories and focus on Noah's flood? Well, partly because one of the privileges of being a geologist is that when you go off into the field, you'll often find something that is not at all what you imagined you were going to find. And this will get back to floods in a minute. But I had the privilege of being on a field excursion to Tibet back in 2002. I was tapped to be sort of the token river guy on a large interdisciplinary project. They needed a fluvial geomorphologist. I got asked if I would like to participate in this big program, and I sort of heard, field trip to Tibet? Yes, of course, I'd love to be involved. And so when we went there, we found some things that were fairly surprising. Things like these flat top topographic terraces up on the valley of the Niang River. So as we drove over from Lhasa down towards the Tsangpo Gorge, which was the focus of this big interdisciplinary proposal. It's the gorge where the Brahmaputra, one of the big rivers of Asia, slices through the Himalaya and drops from the Tibetan plateau all the way down to India through a very narrow, very deep gorge. Incredibly neat topography. On the way from Lhasa, driving to the gorge, on the one road that had been opened just a few years previously, we started seeing these big topographic terraces that rise hundreds of feet up above the river valley. So the river is at about 10,000 feet. The high peaks that are sort of behind what you can see there go up another 10,000 feet or so. It's a spectacular landscape. But we started seeing evidence that there was essentially an ancient lake that had filled this valley. Because this feature is essentially an old river delta, or it's an old lake delta where sediments have been deposited into a standing body of water that came to an elevation of about there at the four set beds of the delta. And obviously there's no lake there today. It's evidence that there was an ancient lake that had filled the valley. And I got really excited when we saw features like this all up and down the valley bottom that suggested that what we were seeing today was not what had been there in the past. And as far as I knew, nobody had actually recognized that that these features were there. The question that came to our minds was, okay, what actually was, what was the dam? If there was a lake, what was holding it in? Why had the lake drained? How old was the lake? The kind of questions that spring to a geologist's mind when they discover evidence like an ancient lake in this valley. And further downstream, where we went to just above the head of the gorge, we found essentially these large glacial moraines that were piles of mud and rock that had been bulldozed off the high peak of Namche Barwa that sits flanking the head of the gorge. The Tsangpo River runs about here. It's just out of the photograph, goes around the backside of these mountains. And there's very compelling evidence that a wall of ice advanced off the high peak and essentially had bulldozed up this pile of dirt and mud, the top elevation of which, where it's truncated, correlates to about the elevation of those topographic terraces. In other words, it looks like we had evidence for a glacial dam that had been the source of this lake. And if there's one thing that a dam made out of dominantly ice does not actually provide for is an awful lot of stability. An ice dam is obviously something that's not going to be terribly stable if once it advances across a river valley, dams the river, a lake forms. Once the lake fills, you've basically created the conditions for a glacial outburst flood, a big flood when the ice dam breaks and all that impounded water rushes down through what's actually one of the deepest gorges on Earth. Having put this together on sort of our first field excursion there, I got really excited. And one of the things we did, and we did not go there to study big ancient glacial lakes or ice-dammed floods that turns out rival the famous Missoula floods in eastern Washington. We'd gone there to study just how the river carved into its gorge over the long run. So I got really excited about this evidence for a glacial damming, and we told the story to a local Tibetan villager who we had hired to take river water samples about it once a month, and we'd come back in a couple of years and collect all the bottles and analyze the chemistry of the water. I told her that we'd discovered that her valley used to be filled with an ancient lake, and that it had probably failed, that the dam had probably failed, resulting in a tremendous flood that drained the lake to expose the valley bottom. And her response was translated back from Tibetan into Chinese into English. And when it came to me, I was really astounded, because what she basically said is like, oh yeah, I know all about that. There were 3 boats up on the side of the valley that were stranded there when the lake drained all of a sudden. And I was like floored. I had just thought that we had actually discovered this, completely new independent geologic evidence for an ancient lake that was in her valley. And how did they actually know that there had been something like that? So I conveyed back to the interpreters, where did you hear this story? And she responded, well, from the lamas at the local temple. We went then to talk to the lamas at the local temple, where this image is on the side of it. This is Padmasambhava, the Tantric Buddha, the guy who introduced Buddhism to Tibet. The high peak of Namcha is in the background. The flanking peak is through there. The lake is essentially the lake that had been dammed by this glacier at those peaks. And he is credited as one of the miracles that he performed to convert the local populace from the animist Bon religion to Buddhism was draining the lake. So I asked the Lama, well, how did he do it? And his response is, well, how would I know how he did it? The important thing is that he did it. But the take-home message that I really grounded it for me is when we got our radiocarbon dates back from those lake sediments. Turned out they dated out at about 1,200 years. There was actually 2 levels, lake levels, a lower one that was 1,200 years, a higher one that was about 10,000 years. And it turns out subsequent work says there have been a lot of different lakes because that glacier's advanced and dammed the river many times. But there's one that came out at 1,200 years. Guess when Padmasambhava actually went through this area? In about the 8th century AD. So this historical figure is credited with draining a lake that may very well be validated by our carbon dating. That got me really interested in, well, how many of the world's other flood stories might actually have some kind of root in events, geological events that actually happened. And that is essentially the field revelation that led me on the sort of long and circuitous path of years later coming to write this book. It got me interested in the global distribution of flood stories. And to basically just take the world's digital topography, or you're just seeing elevation on there, what I want to call your attention to is that flood stories do occur all around the world, but not everywhere around the world. There's a lot of them around the Pacific Rim, essentially from Alaska down to Tierra del Fuego and around the Asiatic Rim. There's across North America, in Scandinavia, in the Middle East and Central Asia. There's not many that I've been able to document. In fact, only none that I've been able to document as credible global flood stories or big flood stories in Africa. There's some in South America. But I got interested in looking at the geography of flood stories to try and see if you filter the views of the stories that one can read in the flood literature through the mechanisms that we know of that could actually have generated big floods, how much of a sense can you make of that? But first of all, let's start with, well, what are the characteristics of the world's flood stories? You can grab images like this off the web where people have basically looked at flood stories from around the world. There's actually, you could sort of fill this out, sort of wrap around the side wall if you really wanted to do a thorough job on it. But the common elements, if you see these sort of green bars that run across all these, are that the world was destroyed by water. Well, it's a flood story, okay? That's got to be a central element. Some kind of vehicle was provided that people survived on. Those are the common elements. In any kind of a flood story, those are the elements you have to have in order to have a flood story. This got me then interested in thinking, well, what about the differences between flood stories? Could the real sort of interesting part of the global distribution of flood stories lie in the kind of details that are in them that differ from one region to another? Now, if folk traditions of flood stories actually do have some basis in real events, and I'm not arguing that all of them do, but if any of them do, you have to basically wrestle with the problem of how could an oral tradition survive transmission over thousands of years? Well, it turns out there's a Klamath Indian story that was recorded in 1865 that I think illustrates pretty well that it's actually feasible for oral histories to be transmitted for, at least 7,700 years or so, for many millennia, most of the Holocene. There's one that essentially reads almost like a very good description of Mount Mazama blowing its top to generate Crater Lake, where if you read it through the eyes of a volcanologist, it kind of reads like an eyewitness description of a Nuée Ardente, a glowing debris avalanche coming off of the mountain, filtered through the culture that was in the area at the time. So if that's the case, and that you can, there's a wonderful book from the 1950s about Indian legends of the Northwest from UC Press that lays that out. So if it turns out that oral traditions could survive through millennia, you can then start to think of, well, where are the stories that actually sound like flood stories that sound like tsunami stories? Stories in which the floods had nothing to do with rain, but the flood rose from the sea. Well, they're in places that are actually tsunami prone. The coast of Alaska, South America, the Pacific Northwest, Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia. There's this one native story from the coast of Chile that tells how two great serpents vied to see who could make the sea rise more, causing an earthquake and sending a great wave onto shore. Sounds an awful lot like a description of a tsunami. And you can go down through this list of places that have flood stories that had nothing to do with rain. In fact, early Christian missionaries in Tahiti were perplexed that the natives had so confused the story of Noah's flood before they'd ever heard it from missionaries that they'd left out the 40 days and nights of rain and just blamed the flood on the action of the sea. There's a geography to things that are probably glacial dam break stories. There's stories like our Tibetan flood story in Scandinavia, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, the Great Lakes region, Mississippi Valley. My favorite is the one that is actually sort of captured over here in a DC comic on the right, telling the tale of how Odin and his brothers killed Ymir the ice giant. And an ice giant's blood, of course, would be water that gushed forth to drown the landscape and create a great flood. In other words, if you start filtering the world's flood stories through some of the details that are in them and look at the kind of processes that actually might generate really big floods in those regions, you can actually start to put some geographical sense on the nature of those stories. I'm obviously not the first person to have ever thought of this or to have even tried to compile it. In fact, I'm nowhere near I've not done the most complete compilation of looks at this. A guy named James Fraser did that back about almost 100 years ago in 1918. And his conclusion, after having surveyed several hundred of the world's flood stories and thinking about them through their details and through the geography of where big floods might occur, is actually worth reading. He said that on the whole then, there seems to be good reason for thinking that some, and probably many, diluvial or flood traditions are merely exaggerated reports of floods which actually occurred, whether as the result of heavy rain, earthquake waves, or other causes. All such traditions, therefore, are partly legendary and partly mythical. So far as they preserve reminiscences of floods which really happened, they are legendary. So far as they describe universal deluges which never happened, they are mythical. He's basically trying to argue that many of the world's flood stories might have a root in events that actually happened, but of course may have been embellished or told through the traditions of various cultures through history. This, of course, brings up the question of, well, what about a historical basis for the biblical flood story? Obviously, in writing a book subtitled the way mine is, I had to wrestle with that. But I just want to point out that my book is certainly not the first book to wrestle with that. People have been doing that for a long time. But there are some ideas, I think, that we can basically dismiss pretty much out of hand. Back in 2002, the Weekly World News trumpeted the fact that Noah's Ark had been discovered on Mars. And perhaps, has Curiosity found this yet, or is this still, no, it's still looking. But the point that I really want to make here is, yes, there's been a lot of claims that have been made about where Noah's Ark is found. I don't really go into that in the book, but what I do want to point out is that some claims about global floods can be refuted fairly easily. Notice how this is an actual photo of this feature, which is thought to be an ark, on Mars, but it's purported to have been obtained by satellite imagery. Notice that this is from the valley bottom looking up, satellites look down. You can basically apply reason fairly simply to dismiss the Weekly World News. Now, I realize that's not news, but it does illustrate essentially the tension that you might have between faith and reason in applying sort of a rational filter to the way people may think about the problem of Noah's flood. But there are a couple ideas for places that may have a historical root of the biblical flood story that, that you can't really dismiss with the application of reason to that degree, as simply as you can the idea that it was found on Mars. And never mind all the theological problems that might come up if Noah's Ark actually was found on Mars. I won't go there. But in 1872, a guy named George Smith, a guy who worked for the British Museum in its basement, who had the job of piecing together cuneiform tablets like this one over here on the right into whole tablets, basically made a shocking discovery when he translated an Assyrian flood story that bore a striking resemblance to the biblical flood story. What was shocking about it was that this story that laid out essentially the warning of a righteous man about a coming flood, the admonition to basically load all his family and animals into a vessel. He converted his hut into a boat. The riding out of 7 days and nights of rainfall, the grounding out of a mountain, the releasing of birds 3 times to actually test whether or not the waters had receded, and then an offering and a rainbow at the end. It's basically the story of Noah's flood. Was basically a story that predated the Bible from Babylonian times by centuries, if not millennia. In fact, subsequent work traced this the story that had its roots in the famous Gilgamesh epic back to several thousand years BC in the Sumerian period. In other words, the story of Noah's flood, its linguistic roots, its literary roots, if you will, can be traced back to the earliest writing that we actually have a record from, these indentations of baked clay from Mesopotamia. Well, what is it about the geography of Mesopotamia that might lend itself to the people there having a flood tradition that they wrote down as one of their first oral traditions? Well, did anybody ever go to New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina and go down to the convention center and look at that sign up about, I don't know, yay high or higher that said sea level? That's a deeply disturbing sign for a geologist to see on a street that far above your head. What is it about the geography of New Orleans that essentially made it very prone to flooding? It's essentially the idea, if you have big estuarine rivers that build levees up on their banks, when a river overtops its levees and the surrounding terrain is at a lower elevation of the levee, everything is underwater. Well, the estuary of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia had much that same geography, very elevated levees and a lot of low terrain in between. Baghdad was under 10 feet of water in the 19th century several times. It was again submerged in the 1950s, and that's well upstream from the estuary that was probably the origin of the ancient Sumerian story down in the estuarine regions. In other words, the physical geography of Mesopotamia is such that the idea that big floods essentially submerged the world that was the whole world to the people living in it at the time is actually a fairly reasonable hypothesis. So that's one possible, plausible, rational explanation for the story of Noah's flood. And again, I'm not proposing that as an original idea. The other one is Ryan and Pittman's Black Sea hypothesis that they proposed a couple decades ago, where they basically proposed that the filling of the Black Sea from the inundation from the Mediterranean that happened as sea level was rising, because at the end of the last glacial period, all the ice was melting off the poles, sea level was coming up. When the Mediterranean breached the Bosporus and decanted into the valley of the Black Sea, which up till that point was a freshwater lake, you'll notice these extensive areas of potential of shallow water today that could have been exposed coastal plains back before the Mediterranean decanted into the Black Sea, is another option for the historical basis for the origin of the story of Noah's flood. Anthropologists have argued that there's essentially a diaspora from this region where people went into Europe, into Egypt, into Mesopotamia about the time of the filling of the Black Sea, about roughly 7,500 years ago or so. I don't remember the dates precisely. But according to the models that have been run subsequently, it would have taken about a month to actually fill up the valley of the Black Sea to get it to top up to sea level. And if you had been living essentially along the margins of this, the biggest freshwater lake in the region, is probably one of the most attractive places to live agriculturally before it filled with salt water. It would have seemed like your whole world went underwater. Now, could the people in the Black Sea have taken the story to Mesopotamia? Quite possibly, in which case maybe a Mesopotamian flood wasn't the origin, maybe it was the Black Sea flood. Frankly, I don't think there's any way to actually test the hypothesis of which it might have been, because once you get back into the sort of oral traditions, the physical evidence trail goes cold. So I'm not trying to argue that either one of these possibilities actually was the origin of Noah's flood. The point I'm trying to make is that there's actually a couple possibilities for a reasonably rational explanation for the origin of the biblical flood story. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but the thing that I found striking is that in the aftermath of Ryan and Pittman's hypothesis, scientists immediately started to argue about it. Why? Well, that's what we do. That's what we're trained to do. People are still arguing about whether it came up 20 or 30 feet or 300 feet and what the timing was, whether it was really sudden, whether it was more gradual, and that's what scientists do. On the other hand, creationists were absolutely outraged that scientists were claiming to have discovered the origin of the story of Noah's flood, to actually have validated a biblical story. They were outraged. There were blog posts accusing these guys of like being in league with the devil and just this wildly crazy things that to me made no sense, because like, wait, these are scientists who are basically saying that the biblical story is right. Why would they be so upset? That got me into thinking about looking into the history of thinking in Christian theology about the relationship between faith and reason, or between science and biblical interpretation, if you want to look at it that way. And what I found in looking into that essentially spurred me to really sort of put this all together into a single book, because the more I looked into it, the more I discovered that this long-running conversation, if you will, in theology between sort of faith in what you think you know to be true and the evidence that you can read in the world around us, the sort of what we know today as reason, the application of reason. Actually, there's a long history of thought around that. Back in the 2nd century AD, Origen, one of the early church fathers, wrote that, "Now what man of intelligence will believe that the first, second, and third day, and the evening and the morning existed without sun and moon and stars? I do not think anyone will doubt that these are figurative expressions which indicated certain mysteries through a semblance of history and not through actual events." Turns out, if you look into sort of a lot of early theological writing, a lot of the arguments in the first few centuries of Christianity were about the symbolic meaning of biblical passages. They weren't about the literal meaning. People are arguing about the meaning of the ark and the animals and the flood through what they could through their symbolic or allegorical meaning, not through their historicity. And there was long conversations about the relationship between faith and reason filtered through that thought. St. Augustine, for example, in the 4th century AD, wrote that, "Let no one think that because the psalmist says he established the earth above the water, that we must use this testimony of Holy Scripture against the people who engage in learned discussions. For ignorant of the sense of these words, they will more readily scorn our sacred books than disavow the knowledge that they have acquired by unassailable arguments or provided by the evidence of experience." What Augustine was arguing quite explicitly is that from a theological angle, if Christians basically argued that things were true that people could see for themselves were not in fact true, it wasn't going to do them any good in proselytizing or spreading their religion very far. And that this argument about how much faith people could have in what they learned from the world around them, what we would now essentially call science, it has deep roots in Christian theology. I never knew that before I started actually researching this book. Augustine, though, it turns out, actually believed Noah's flood was a global flood. What I came to realize in researching this book, though, is that he actually came to that belief through the application of reason. Why? Well, he basically saw, like others, his contemporaries in the ancient world, seashells in the rocks on mountaintops. And if you think about a worldview in which you didn't know any geology, you didn't have the kinds of concepts that we have today, but you had the fundamental observation there were marine organisms buried in rocks that are entombed on the highest peaks you knew about, the logical conclusion to come to, not knowing anything else, was that the sea once covered the peaks. And that's essentially what Augustine argued. St. Thomas Aquinas, almost 1,000 years later, also accepted the reality of a global flood for pretty much the same reasons, but argued for understanding nature, what he called God's other book, in seeking to understand both Scripture and the world around us. And it's that sort of parallel development of concepts of what one could have faith in through one's religious beliefs and what one could learn from the application of reason to the natural world. That tension has shaped the way people looked at the story of Noah's flood for centuries now, and it actually helped spur the development of the science of geology in ways that we don't tend to teach in our history of science. Even the famous story of Galileo Galilei, who was famously persecuted for his outrageous views about the relationship between the earth and the sun, wrote that I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reasons, and intellect has intended us to forgo their use. He was pretty obviously a champion of reason. He thought if you saw moons circling Jupiter, it meant moons were circling Jupiter. If you saw mountains on the moon, which weren't supposed to be there, why? Because God was thought to have created perfect spheres. A rumpled mountain system on the moon wasn't supposed to be there because one of the great theories of the origin of topography at the time was that topography was the result of the destruction of the Earth through Noah's flood, where we'll get in a minute again. And so since people hadn't lived on the moon, how could the moon have suffered from the indignity of Noah's flood? Well, Galileo, as it turns out, wasn't actually trying to challenge the church head-on in terms of theological interpretations. He was basically observing things and interpreting them rationally. If you read some of his letters, like this excerpt from a letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, he wrote that if anyone shall set the authority of Holy Writ against clear and manifest reason, he who does this knows not what he has undertaken, for he opposes to the truth not the meaning of the Bible, which is beyond his comprehension, but rather his own interpretation, not what is in the Bible, but what he has found in himself and imagines to be there. In other words, Galileo was basically arguing that when you came to a choice between how one interpreted the Bible and an observation you could validate for yourself, the observation trumped the interpretation. That's what he got in trouble for. So if we look back at the 17th century, sort of in Galileo's time, there were essentially three theories for the origin of topography. So we get back to the story of the history of thinking about the geology and geomorphology about Noah's flood. In the 17th century, there are three big theories. Landscapes were shaped on the third day of creation, that the world just came the way we see it today. It's as it's ever been, as it always will be kind of stuff. And secondly, that topography was carved by Noah's flood, that sort of mountains that we see and all the disrupted geology that we see in the surface of the earth was passed down from that single event. And why those two? Well, those are the only two events that you have in the Bible that could essentially plausibly explain, or implausibly, explain geologic history. And third, there was the earthquakes that had played a minor role in shaping of the land, but by that day enough earthquakes had happened and people had seen their effects that they were willing to give it a secondary, a supporting role in the evolution of topography. So there's sort of two big ideas for the origin of topography in the 17th century. And one of the first grand theories to try and explain the origin of the world's topography through some kind of mechanistic analysis was actually offered by a Cambridge theologian, Thomas Burnet. He basically was trying to explain something that bothered many people who thought about this, many of the natural philosophers who thought about the origin of topography in the 17th century. And that was that if you added up all the water on Earth, there simply wasn't enough to cover the highest peaks. So the problem of Noah's flood in the mid-17th century was, where did all the water come from and where did it all go to? Because the theory was that Noah's flood was global and had happened, but they realized that there was an observational deficiency. There wasn't enough water on the planet to actually explain it. Burnet came up with a very clever and spectacularly wrong idea when he basically posited that, well, the solution to that dilemma was that the world wasn't created the way we see it now. It was created as a perfect oblate spheroid, not quite a sphere, more like an egg-like feature, and that it had an internal structure that was fairly unique. It had an outer shell of essentially stones and rocks that formed a crust over an interior sea, the sort of lighter layer in the middle, and that surrounded a rocky core. In other words, a three-layer structure, sort of rocks, water, and rocks. Now, he immediately got into trouble because people pointed out that, was anybody ever tried to float a stone in a glass of water? Doesn't work very well. Then there's simple density problems that people were aware of in the 17th century that made Burnet's mechanism not all that plausible. But what Burnet basically proposed was that the world was created this way, and the sun heated up and cracked the outer crust, and right at the peak of human wickedness, that crust foundered into that inner sea, generating Noah's flood. So he was originally criticized from both philosophical and theological angles. The natural philosophers pointed out his density inversion problem, and the theologians pointed out the problem that, well, if God actually knew that people had planned in advance the destruction of the world and his very creation of it and his setup of it, then he kind of knew people would fail the test that essentially was the whole purpose of the story of Noah's flood in the first place. So there's both theological and scientific problems. Which are probably why Burnet's name is mostly lost to history other than as an entertaining footnote. Nicholas Steno, on the other hand, had a different deal. he's widely revered as the grandfather of the modern science of geology because he formalized the basic principles that still underpin the science. His attempts to explain, what got him into thinking about that was dissecting the head of a great white shark that washed up on a beach in Italy, and he recognized that the teeth of the shark basically matched these what had been called tongue stones, basically fossilized shark teeth that people had been trying to explain for a long time. And he said, "Oh, these are the teeth of sharks." But how do the teeth of sharks, these tongue stones that people had found throughout Europe and in Malta in particular, how did they end up entombed in rocks? Like actually you could observe them to have been in the field. So he started thinking about, well, how could the teeth of a shark get entombed in a rock? This led him to formalize principles that still underlie the science of geology. The basic idea is that if you have a layer of rocks, the stuff on the bottom was laid down first, so it would be older to younger in terms of a stratigraphic pile, and that rocks laid down by settling in water are laid down horizontally. Two principles that he wanted to essentially establish as being so logical, natural, and obvious that nobody could actually challenge those principles, so therefore inferences you made by the application of those principles were equally unassailable. And what we tend to forget is that Steno basically then applied those principles to try and explain the geologic evolution of the Tuscan landscape where around Florence where he lived, in a six-step model, the third step of which was the collapse of an undermined crust down into a great subterranean canyons filled with water, generating, yes, you guessed it, Noah's flood. So the very roots and origins of the science of geology can be traced back to an attempt to formalize through rational analysis the explanation of the story of Noah's flood. Fossils in the late, after Steno's revelation with shark's teeth, fossils were widely once again seen as evidence of a global flood. This fossil over here on the right is Homo diluvitestis, a fossil that was dug out of the Swiss Alps back in 1720s, I believe it was, and that Jacob Seucher wrote about in his Sacred Physics in 1731. He basically claimed that it was a fossil human, and the argument was, what better proof of a global flood than people who were interred by it? Well, it turns out the big problem with it is that that's not actually a human fossil, it's a giant salamander. But that wasn't recognized for another 50 years or so. There were mammoth bones that were found in upstate New York and across Europe that were put on display that were basically trumpeted as evidence that Adam was well over 100 feet tall. Why? Well, there's a biblical passage about there being giants in those days, and if you found the femur of a mammoth and you weren't thinking elephant, you were thinking, wow, big femur. Scale up a person, they would have been 100 feet tall, and then you validate that with the biblical passage, and all of a sudden you're good to go. But so in the early 18th century, the idea that Noah's flood was a global flood was still current, but people were starting to apply rational analysis, starting to apply Steno's principles to interpreting the geology of Europe. And as they did, they started to discover other things, such as geologic time. James Hutton, who is a Scottish farmer and intellectual who basically came to the conclusion that Earth is unimaginably old, in part through finding this outcrop on the Scottish coast, the one that I used to grace the cover of my book. And I will note, just for the record, that I managed to go to Siccar Point on the Scottish coast on a sunny day. This doesn't happen very often. It's kind of like a sunny day in Seattle. So in any case, what he basically saw in this outcrop was evidence for more events in geologic history than could simply be explained by the story of a creation followed by Noah's flood, which up to that point had been essentially the model for the amount of time that was available for dealing with this. And the basic idea is that you have these rocks that, using Steno's principles, you can interpret these rocks that are a vertically bedded sandstone unit that's gray and a inclined sandstone unit that's red, the Devonian old red sandstone and the Silurian greywacke. The vertical gray stuff is a little stained by the red overlying stuff. But if you think about those principles, that these rocks would have had to have been laid down flat, originally, and the younger stuff is older than the stuff on top, and it's a rock made out of sand. You can read the basic story that, okay, these beds were laid down horizontally in sand in a sea. It was buried deep enough to be basically converted, heated and compressed into rock. Then it had to have been tilted up. It had to then be planed off. Another round of sand had to be laid on top. Then the whole thing had to be buried again deep enough to turn the upper rocks into rock, and then it got tipped up, so that was tipped up. In other words, there's two grand cycles of deposition and deformation. Hutton interpreted this as essentially the life and death of two mountain ranges, because the sand had to come from somewhere. It got eroded off topography to be deposited in the marine environment. Then it got deformed. Then it got more stuff put on top of it. And he basically got that right. But what he then went on to say is that, well, how long does it take to give rise to and erode away two mountain ranges? Two grand cycles. In his view, that was more time than he could possibly imagine, and his sort of fairly stilted prose wrote of the immensity of geologic time. But his observations were sound and were in the realm of people applying Steno's principles to understand the geology of Europe and coming to the realization that there were far more periods in geologic time than could possibly be explained by the biblical flood story. By the 18th century, European geologists had defined four primary epochs of geologic time by essentially looking at mapping the geology of Europe. There were the primary rocks, the crystalline rocks that formerly had been thought to have been laid down at the creation. There were secondary rocks that were stratified. There were layered rocks, but they had fossils. There were tertiary rocks that were made out of the detritus from the primary and secondary rocks, and there was a quaternary layer of superficial sediments overlying it all. In other words, there were more periods of geologic time than could be accounted for by a simple literal interpretation of biblical stories. There was more to Earth history than had been covered, apparently, in the Bible. And this was becoming fairly widely known by the close of the 18th century. And the other gentleman whose work I'll mention very briefly is Georges Cuvier, who was a vertebrate anatomist. He's sort of viewed as the father of vertebrate anatomy and paleontology. And he basically showed that fossil mammoths were not from any living species of elephant. They were extinct. He basically got samples of modern Indian and African elephants and compared them with the skulls of mammoths that were fossils that had been dug out of rocks or bogs. And he basically concluded that mammoths were not like any living animal. And this created a huge theological problem because there was no room in the Bible for extinctions. Noah saved two of everything, right? So the problem of extinctions became sort of a theological problem, but in terms of a geological problem, what he also went on to find is that each of the, by then, 6 epochs of geologic time had a different fauna. That essentially the flora and fauna, that the organisms in different successive worlds that were recorded by the geologic record were all different. In other words, that extinctions weren't just rare, they were kind of the norm if you look back through geologic history. And he basically came up with the idea that, well, the world had been destroyed by multiple catastrophes, that each transition between geological epochs actually was accompanied by a new catastrophe. In other words, that Noah's flood wasn't adequate to explain Earth history, not because there wasn't a global flood, but because there had been too many of them. Well, you can summarize the geologic hunt for Noah's flood in the following way. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it was recognized that the rock record involved a lot more events than the simple creation and the flood. But late in the 18th and the early 19th centuries, it was widely thought that the flood recorded superficial deposits that represented just the most recent of many catastrophes. And there are lots of theological accommodations to try and explain that, like the 6 epochs of geologic time thought about at that time, each mapped onto a single day of creation, or that there was sort of a secret hidden verse between the first 2 verses of Genesis, a gap in the narrative that you could stuff all of Earth history into. In other words, there are theological accommodations, but by about the time that Louis Agassiz explained most of the superficial geology of Northern Europe that had been previously ascribed to Noah's flood as actually the signature of an ice age, the case for a global flood completely cratered. And by the middle of the 19th century, the case for a global flood had been widely refuted. And Edward Hitchcock, who was a professor of both theology and geology at Amherst. In fact, I should mention that most of the people I've been talking about so far, most of them were some combination of a natural philosopher or scientist and theologian. They were that the so-called conflict between science and religion often occurred within individuals, not between camps back centuries ago. So Hitchcock summarized nicely sort of conventional thinking in both the scientific and theological worlds in the middle of the 19th century. When he wrote that the history of opinions respecting the deluge of Noah is one of the most curious and instructive in the annals of man. Almost every geological change which the earth has undergone, from its center to its circumference, has at one time or another been ascribed to this deluge. And so plain has this seemed to those who had only a partial view of the facts, that those who doubted it were often denounced as enemies of revelation. But most of these opinions and this dogmatism are now abandoned because both nature and scripture are better understood. In other words, by the middle of the 19th century, 150 years ago, it was essentially conventional wisdom that there wasn't really room for conflict between faith and reason, that they were, if you reinterpreted faith, you could align it with reason. Now, geologists pretty much walked away from really big floods at that point, so from the late 19th century, to the degree to which that when J. Harlan Bretz discovered that a tongue of ice had dammed the South Fork of the Clark River in Montana, building this big lake, and that the ice dam, just like the Tibetan ice dam, wasn't very stable. It had failed generating the whole Missoula floods that scoured out the topography of eastern Washington. When he discovered this, his colleagues didn't believe him for about 6-7 decades, because the idea of really big floods had been so essentially stigmatized by the defeat of the Noachian deluge as a global flood hypothesis in the 19th century that it literally took, not quite a century, but more than half a century to convince the geological community that Bretz's Missoula floods were real. I give Bretz about half a chapter in the book. His story is a great story in terms of scientists not necessarily being open to new ideas either. But the part I really want to emphasize today is sort of the converse. And that is, how could views like those on display at the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky, which I visited as part of the research for this book, sort of be as widespread as they are today? And I love sort of the image of Darwin running through there, and the Adam and Eve sort of in through here. They actually are portrayed in what looks like a hot tub. It's a very, very strange place. You see things like Eve feeding a carrot to a squirrel, which doesn't show up very well, but she's sitting right next to a Jurassic Park velociraptor. And the velociraptor is not chasing her, which is the part that just doesn't work for me. And so I sort of wonder, and you see things like a stegosaur with a saddle on it for the kids to ride around. And the basic idea, one of the ideas you see in the Creation Museum is that people had to coexist with dinosaurs, because if there was just the creation, and if Noah's flood explains all of Earth history and all the fossils in all the rocks in all the world, well, dinosaurs are found in fossils, so they had to be around with people before the flood. And so apparently we coexisted in harmony for some period of time. And there's other rather strange ideas on display there. And I meant to preface this by basically arguing that, today the polls that one can look at basically argue that somewhere around 40% of the American public buy into the ideas expressed in the Creation Museum, creationism at some level, whether it's the age of the Earth being a few thousand years old, or that people having been relatively recent addition to the planet. Different polls phrase it in different ways, but a shocking percentage of the American public believes things about Earth history that geologists refuted centuries ago. And some of the displays that you see there are that explicitly reason is the enemy of faith, which would have shocked Augustine and Origen. But the displays basically dismiss reason as the enemy of faith and literally accuse scientists of a centuries-long conspiracy to question, destroy, discredit, criticize, poison, and replace God's word. Each of these italicized words gets a big display banner that, illustrating how people like Sir Francis Bacon were in league with people today, somehow pulling off the greatest conspiracy of all time that I never got taught in my geologic training. So there's some very mysterious displays there, but there's also the argument that Noah's flood deposited all the world's sedimentary rocks and fossils. Basically the old refuted ideas, including, for example, things like this pair of mating turtles that were fossilized. And it's just really hard for me to imagine how turtles could maintain their position through something like this at a global scale. It's just, and they also at the Creation Museum, they have a display of dinosaur footprints in sedimentary rocks. Now, if you believe that all the world's sedimentary rocks were laid down by Noah's flood, that then should lead you to the question, if you're applying your rational filter, of what were dinosaurs doing walking around on the bottom of the sea? Especially air-breathing dinosaurs. It just doesn't make any sense. So I actually wrote out about a 200-page treatment of the arguments that the modern proponents of flood geology use to explain why Noah's flood is global and explained all the world's sedimentary rocks and why geologists really don't know what we're talking about. Wrote about almost 200 pages worth of a sort of a item-by-item refutation, and my editor basically said, David, this is just like too much. Stick with your top 3 reasons and go a little, because you've kind of got them at that. And so what I view as the 3 fatal flaws of flood geology are, first, the problem that Thomas Burnett was trying to explain away 300-400 years ago. There's not enough water on Earth to cover Mount Everest, despite what you see in the movie 2012, where they did a pretty good job of animating that process. And just for the record, it's probably not one of the best disaster movies ever, which is why it's basically on sale at a clearance. But anyway, there's the classic problem of where'd the water come from, where it go to, it just doesn't pencil out. Secondarily, there's the problem that the geologic record involved more than a chaotic globe-wrecking flood. Any geologist here knows that, but if you want to look at the record, the Grand Canyon, where I actually start with the book with a hike out of it to explain what a geologist could actually see in the rock record first when you walk through it with firsthand, you'll notice that there's 3 different packets of rocks. There's the crystalline Vishnu schist at the bottom, there's inclined sedimentary rocks, and then there's flat-lying sedimentary rocks. In other words, there's 3 big packages of rocks, not the 2. If you had the creation and Noah's flood laying this all down, what's this awkward little third bit sitting in there? In other words, and the story of European geology having many more eras than could be explained by the biblical flood also has that problem. So in other words, the geologic record's a lot more complex, a lot more events. You can add up the time required to settle layers of finely laminated silt to sand in deposits around the world, and you get well more than a year no matter how you do it. And finally, there's the problem of fossils. And the problem of fossils, and so this is the other reason dinosaurs went extinct. And the real problem with fossils that I didn't mention yet is that if you look at the fossil record, 99.99 or something % of all the fossils we have are extinct species. I mean, the defining characteristic of the fossil record is that the stuff in it isn't like the stuff that's around today. We have a small proportion of modern species are actually fossilized. Now, you take the defining characteristic of the story of Noah's flood. What did Noah do? He saved 2 of everything. So if you were to actually apply creationist's own logic to interpreting the problem of fossils, what you would basically be faced with is you'd be faced with the idea that what you should find, if they were correct in the fossil record, is that you would find modern species. There'd be no discontinuity in the types of species across the boundary that they would think of as Noah's flood. In other words, the rocks should be full of fossils of modern organisms. It's 100, what you see is 180 degrees from that. The dominant story of fossils is that extinctions are the norm in Earth history, and that simply has no place in the biblical story. So this led me to start thinking about, well, what was the rise and birth of modern creationism? We can really trace it back to this book, The Genesis Flood, that was published in 1961, and it launched the revival of young Earth creationism. If you look back in the days right after the Scopes trial, young Earth creationism was virtually dead. There was almost no public depth to it. Even the original fundamentalists, the guys who wrote the tracts, The Fundamentals, that became the fundamentalists, the geologically inclined people who were working with them basically believed that the world was old and not shaped by Noah's flood. So what happened between then and today, when young Earth creationism has such sort of cultural and such political roots, where there's people in Congress arguing that the world is very young and that evolution is evil? Well, these guys basically, I think, get a lot of the credit for writing what turned out to be a very compelling and, frankly, misleading book. They basically are very clear that they're basically looking at the story of Earth history through the lens of Noah's flood based on the decision that the biblical story is right, and they go and look for evidence that actually backs up their story. And they're actually very plain and honest about their doing that. which surprised me. I actually read this book for myself as I was doing the research for this, because I really wondered how people could think and believe that way today. And it was illuminating, in great part, because think about when they wrote this. They offered an insightful critique of 1950s geology. They asked a series of questions right off the bat in their book that basically geologists did not have good answers for in the 1950s. What killed off the dinosaurs? How did great stacks of sedimentary rock end up stranded on continents high above sea level? What were those fossils doing in sedimentary rocks up on mountaintops anyway? How could mountains actually rise? What was the mechanism? How did fossils of tropical flora end up in rocks at the poles, if the world had always been the way it was today? In other words, they asked questions that were actually a pretty darn insightful critique of 1950s geology, and that floored me. I had thought these guys were probably not very well informed. Well, it turns out they were pretty well informed about how to critique 1950s geology, but their answer, they basically invoked a global flood that resurfaced the world and deposited all the sedimentary rocks and fossils, forgetting sort of at least those three fatal flaws that I just mentioned. In other words, they recycled Thomas Burnett's long discredited 17th century model. They knew the answer. They thought geologists didn't know the answer. They provided their own. What did they miss? Well, they missed plate tectonics. They were writing in the 1950s. They published their book in 1961. The idea of plate tectonics that essentially stitched together the way that we think about the surface of the Earth and how it works today, why there are mountains in different areas, why there are volcanoes, or why there's different suites of rocks in different parts of the world. I mean, plate tectonics was essentially the concept that revolutionized geology in the way that Darwin or DNA, whichever one you want to pick, revolutionized biology, whichever time you want to pick. And these guys didn't know about it. Problem is, they never looked back. They never reconnected. They just kept going with long discredited models. And that was essentially a revelation to me that their thinking was that they actually had a reason for the arguments they put forward. The other thing I learned in writing this book was that I'd been essentially thinking of creationism versus evolution as sort of faith versus science in terms of the kinds of diametrically opposed conversations that we have in our modern culture. And yet when you actually look into the sort of the range of philosophical distinctions between these two end-member viewpoints, there's an awful lot of shading, and people have a long history of people arguing about the ground in between faith and reason, trying to argue that, well, maybe they're not mutually exclusive, or maybe they're not in conflict, or how do you balance them? In other words, there's fairly a rich spectrum of thinking about the relationship between faith and reason that we don't tend to hear about, think about, or teach about very much. In my own view, essentially based on doing this work, all this synthesis for the book, was that the war between science and religion that is essentially advertised and promoted today, which is probably better viewed as a conflict within religion over how to view science. And that's, I think, a very important and real distinction. Because modern creationists, if you look at the history of Christian theology, modern creationists abandoned faith in what we can learn from the study of nature, what Thomas Aquinas called God's other book 1,000 years ago. And in that sense, you can make a very real case that creationism is actually very bad theology. Now, I'm not a theologian, I'm a geologist, obviously, and so we can ask the question of, well, why write a book like this? Why is this important? Why worry about this today? And essentially, the case that I would offer is that people have always sort of filtered what we know between what we believe to be true and what we can see for ourselves to be true. The filter of faith and the lens of reason. And we will always do that. And scientists do it, theologians do it, creationists do it, and just change the terms for each one. But today, at this point in history, we sort of face a confluence of global issues where really sort of indulging the idea that there's a fundamental conflict between science and religion is, I think, more dangerous today than it ever has been. It's gotten plenty of people in trouble in the past. And I think as we face the kinds of global environmental challenges that we have of this century, where we really do need to solve some basic environmental, cultural, social, and economic issues and how they integrate with each other, if we're going to maintain civilization on this rock in space for more than another few decades or century at the outside, we really have to address and solve many of those problems. And the degree to which cultural friction is absorbed in an artificial conflict between science and religion is not going to help us get there. I could go on about that, but that, to me, that's enough motivation to think about why to write this book. I obviously encourage everybody to pick up about 12 copies and give them to everybody you know. I did bring a few with me today if anyone wants to pick one up, but I'll also shamelessly plug my previous 2 books, Dirt and King of Fish, because I obviously have a vested interest in doing that. But in any case, I'd be glad to take, I don't know what the timing is, but I'd be glad to take questions. And if anyone wants to pick up a book, feel free to come up and bug me about it. Thank you very much for your attention and for the invitation to come down and talk to you today.
David, thanks for a really interesting talk. I'm going to open it up to questions. I want to say, if you've attended any of these lectures in the past few years, you know, this is the time in the talk where I give an award to, or a plaque to the speaker. Well, this year, it was about Wednesday, I realized that my duties, I had failed this planning process, and even FedEx couldn't bail me out. So David, you'll get your award later at your, you don't have to carry it around with you now. So, but anyway, I want to open it up for questions. We're going to record them, so I'll pass this mic around to anybody that wants to ask a question to David. So raise your hand and I'll give it to you.
Hi, David. What's the twist on the authors of this influential book in the 50s that one of them was purported to be a geologist or wasn't a geologist? Could you just enlighten us on that, thanks?
Yes, Henry Morris was a hydraulic engineer at Virginia Tech. He was not a geologist, but he did study flowing water. So he had some technical credibility in that field. The other, John Whitcomb, was an Old Testament scholar. So it was basically a theologian and an engineer. And that one interesting thing about Morris was that he actually, when he was presented with the evidence that some of they had this famous photograph in their book about a fossil footprint that had another footprint in it that was a dinosaur footprint that someone claimed had a human footprint in it, and therefore people and dinosaurs did exist and geologists were all wrong about everything. He actually went and saw that, and late in his life basically wrote a letter admitting that this was not a human footprint. I don't believe they ever revised the book. But Ronald Numbers, in his great book, The Creationists, I think tells that story.
I know that you were on Fox News talking about your book. So I was just wondering, I know because we're friends, I know you told me that. And I wonder, you said that they were really happy about your book and pleased with your book. I mean, are they just somehow in such denial about reality that they thought you were on their side? Or could you talk a little bit about that? That really interests me.
I'd be happy to talk about that. It was one of the weirdest interviews I've ever had. But I actually, because I was very nervous about, well, what would Fox News do with a book like this? And it turns out that some of the scrolling stuff, if you actually watch it, the scrolling sort of, I don't know what you call it, but the scrolling text that goes along underneath what I was talking about doesn't really match the conversation. So, and the guy who was interviewing me, I think basically sort of went off script and just started this conversation. The interview actually went very well. And I started it with saying, well, geologists know that Noah's flood was not global. It was refuted several centuries ago. So the question is, what might be the rational origin of the story? And it turns out the interviewer was really interested in that. And they played it really clean and straight. I was very happy with it. It was on Fox and Friends, and I would be happy to appear on that again. And I would not have guessed that from before. I approached the interview with great trepidation. Even got my hair cut.
Anybody else? I asked him the same question earlier. I had an hour with him, so I was curious how that went.
How did you know he was on Fox News?
Well, he told me, and I told him about my experience once with Fox News too. Anybody else have a question? Yes, Ignacio.
I think we're all silent because there are so many questions that really come out. You cover so many things, but I might just talk about or ask you something about a story that you started developing at the beginning and then left out, which was the geographical correlation between stories and I don't know what. I don't think I got the...
Basically, if you look at the geographic, if you look at the geography of the mechanisms that could cause really big floods, there's glacial dam break floods. And where might those occur? Well, circumpolar regions like Scandinavia, Iceland, the American Midwest, Alaska, Washington, Tibet, places that had big glacial ice dams. And there's stories in those regions that involve ice and water and that essentially have a connection that you could filter. The details in it sort of map onto reasonably what you might expect to be the mechanism there as an ice dam flood. In areas that are subject to tsunamis, like the tsunami-prone Pacific Rim, Southeast Asia, places where tsunamis are a very natural and repeating phenomena, a lot of flood stories basically have details like the flood coming out of the sea unexpectedly, things that or the ground shook and the wave came onto land in the Northwest and in Chile, details that read a lot like tsunamis. So if you start putting that sort of geography together, you can cover in a lot of the world's flood stories with sort of reasonable hypothesized mechanisms. And the big exceptions are the Middle East, in which case you're dealing with the Tigris and Euphrates and maybe the sort of the lowland estuarine flooding or the Black Sea flood. And again, I don't know how to adjudicate between those two. And there's other flood stories. There's some in South America that read like sort of upstream dam break floods. And you could, if you really did sort of a complete census of them all, it could actually be very interesting and take an awful lot of time.
You were talking about the Ryan and Pittman hypothesis. I think, was there a book published about 20 years ago on that?
Yes, Ryan and Pittman published a book, had Noah's Flood in the title. I forget the actual title.
There was an oil company was doing a geological survey of the floor of the Bosphorus Straits and found there was a discontinuity that didn't make any sense. It was consistent with some sort of volcanic plug, maybe suddenly disrupting. Is that still... You've heard the story, presumably.
Well, yeah, no, the idea that the Mediterranean overtopped the Bosporus and filled up the Black Sea, or topped up the Black Sea, is good. The question is, how much did it rise and how fast did it rise? And therein lies the connection to Noah's flood. And it was, they were drilling, the basic geologic observations, when they drilled cores in the bottom of the Black Sea, you find essentially there's saltwater organisms in the superficial sediments. There's like a black goo, like a death horizon, below which there's freshwater stuff. And so and the carbon dates on that black, organic, rich, sort of everything in the basin died horizon, all come out at about the same date of about 7,500 years, if I'm remember the date about right. So the mysterious part is they had this transition from freshwater to saltwater through the whole basin all at once. And they tied it back into the breaching of the Bosporus and the decanting of salt water into a freshwater lake. But some people are arguing that it actually happened earlier in multiple stages, that it didn't go up as much as they originally argued. But in any case, the amount of the rise in the local lake level, sort of getting up to sea level, is enough to have drowned anybody who stayed put.
David, I want to toss you a softball.
Oh,
Tell
yeah.
us about your next book project, because David has a very interesting project he's working on.
Well, my wife and I are actually working on a book together that is, it's going to be called The Hidden Half of Nature, is the provisional title. We're just finishing the proposal. We've written big pieces of it, but it's about how Anne restored our garden and the role that microbes play in essentially supporting ecosystems above ground and in our own health. She works in public health, and so it's sort of combining the soils and public health ideas and trying to make the argument that the sort of the hidden world around us is actually incredibly important and that we don't pay it anywhere near as much attention as we should. And it's going to be a wonderful book because she writes much better than I do.
Well, what I think I'll do is invite all of you outside to the reception in the hallway, and you can take your time and talk to David in person. And David, again, thanks again for just a fabulous talk.
Thank you.